Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Haunting Hour episode review. This episode comes from Season 2. It was written by Jessica Scott and Eric Patterson, and it was directed by Neil Fernley. And the episode in question is Pumpkinhead. Now, Pumpkinhead, I remember when this episode came out because at that point of the show's history, around early Season 2, I was already recording the entire series from the Hub Network onto my DVR. And I remember it was around Halloween, I think in 2011, maybe 2012. I can't remember exactly, but it had to be around that point when this episode dropped. And I immediately, when I saw that the episode was coming out, I went home, put on my DVR, saw that it recorded, and I watched it. And I remember I absolutely loved it then. And watching it now I've seen this episode maybe a collective of 5 to 6 times in my lifetime as of this point. I think that this is a really great episode still. Now, is it the best episode from the Haunting Hour? I guess it depends on the criteria, because this episode I see commonly maybe next to Scarecrow and maybe Mascot thrown out there by the general community as the top 3 best episodes consistently. Whether it depends on the person you're talking to. Some people might have Scarecrow, some people might have Mascot, some people might have Pumpkinhead. And I get why people think that this is up there, but to me, I just see more problems with it than I think people give it credit for. Now, for posterity, I actually went and read the Nightmare Hour short story to compare with this. I did not watch the sequel episode to this, Return of the Pumpkinheads, yet. And if you're wondering when am I ever going to drop a review on this, I'm actually slowly going through each individual story in this book, and I'm jotting down notes until I end up finishing it, then I'll eventually make a review. But I read the short story, and I was kind of marveled at just how different this episode interpretation was. So, given what we saw there, I can totally see that they could not directly adapt everything from that short story, which I think actually had darker elements than what this episode had, but this also introduced what it needed to kind of work around that and make it succeed. But yeah, nonetheless, if you have not seen Pumpkinhead from the Haunting Hour, you should go check this out. This one is pretty much played up straight for horror. This one kind of provides some horror legitimacy to the Haunting Hour. It's not just some dumb schlock for kids and some goofy stuff or some existential Twilight Zone ripoff stuff. It can actually be genuinely scary, and I would say that this has to be up there maybe with the Dreamcatcher episode as the absolute scariest episode from this entire show. So yeah, go watch this, especially if you're looking to actually possibly get scared. So with that out the way, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away of Pumpkinhead. So in this episode version here, it varies quite dramatically from the short story, because I think in the short story, the characters' names were Andrew, Mike, and Liz. And Liz wasn't even a sibling to Andrew and Mike, who were brothers. But in this version, we have 3 siblings named Scott, Allie, and Dave. And Allie's the oldest, who's played by Casey Rawl, and she can drive a car. And it's become Halloween Day, and the youngest brother, Dave, who's played by, I think Frankie Jonas, is at home wanting to carve bigger pumpkins, and they know of a guy called Mr. Palmer, who has possible pumpkins to go look at. But the problem is that he's just a mean old guy. And before all of this happened, we saw out in the street missing child poster, which kind of insinuates possibly where the story is heading with these 3 kids, but I digress. They decide once their mom leaves to go to the pumpkin patch and look at some pumpkins. And I guess the middle sibling, Scott, who I guess is the main character of the story in some ways, he wants to go exploring there and try to get the best pumpkins. And when they arrive to the pumpkin patch, they notice that there's, a field that looks picked over, but there's like this private patch area where they're not supposed to be in, but the kids decide to go in there anyway, and they see these weird pumpkins with some coverings on them, and they're making a commotion, and this catches the attention of Mr. Palmer, who essentially wants to throw them out. But before they can get thrown out, they also went exploring in this private section, and they went inside of this building, and they see what appears to be scarecrows wearing pumpkin heads set up in weird positions. And you got like 3 of them, in a room looking like they're about to like bloody assassinate each other with weapons. There's another room with one strapped to an operating table, and you're like, what in the world are they doing in this episode here? But nonetheless, once they were pretty much forced off the property, Scott is like, you know what? We're not going empty-handed, Dave. We're going to take 2 pumpkins with us, and we're going to peel out. So they grab 2 pumpkins. They go through the back gate, but they might be being followed by a potential creature, so to speak. And it's made more evident once they peel off and they head back to the house that a creature has kind of wandered into their front yard and might be looking onward to see what they're doing. Well, inside, the 2 brothers, they decide to set up at the kitchen table and carve some pumpkins. And from an hour from that point, they're going to get dressed up and they're going to go trick-or-treating. Well, once Dave opens his pumpkin and sees that there's a bunch of worms in it, and Scott opens his and sees that his is looking right, he seems to think that these pumpkins were tampered with by Mr. Palmer, who was upset for some reason for them breaking on his property, and somehow he sabotaged those pumpkins after he kicked them out, which, you got to use some brain cells there, bud. But nonetheless, Scott is like, you know what? I don't really care about going trick-or-treating. I just want to get back at Mr. Palmer for embarrassing us like that. Well, they get ready and they, dress up in their costumes. And Scott is told by his older sister, Allie, to not go back to the pumpkin patch. They were kicked out. It's not smart to go back there. There's no reason to upset the guy even further. But Scott decides to leave and go on his own accord to the pumpkin patch. And his sister and his brother, they're going to go trick-or-treating, but since kids have gone missing in their neighborhood, they can't go trick-or-treating in their neighborhood. They have to go towards, I think, their school cafeteria, where they're doing kind of like a trunk-or-treat, but in a public school, so kids are safe with parental supervision. But the sister realizes that Scott is missing and tries to get a hold of him, can't get a hold of him, and she realizes that he must have gone to the pumpkin patch. And before they can go trick-or-treating at the school, or maybe they went there and they realized Scott was missing. I forget the exact details, but something like that. Well, they decide to go look for Scott at the pumpkin patch, and we see something possibly might have happened to Scott, and but we don't really know what exactly is going on there. But when Allie arrives with Dave, Dave stays in the car, or I guess he's not feeling well. He just wants to hang out in there while Allie goes to try to hunt him down. And Allie stumbles across the private pumpkin patch area and goes, investigates further, and notices that these scarecrows from earlier might have, changed directions, and the operating room table now has a doctor with like a bloody mask, and she's freaked out, and she's like, okay, this prank stuff has gone too far. Scott, you need to come out and you need to, bring yourself forward. And as Allie thinks she hears something and might be approached by something, she freaks out and goes outside, and she learns a grisly truth about possibly what has happened to Scott. And this is all recontextualized by a massive reveal to Allie about what's exactly going on, what's going on in this private pumpkin patch. And this might tie into like the first 10 seconds of the episode with the missing kids flyers. You could put 2 and 2 together. Yeah. And let's just say before we know what's going to happen to Allie and Dave, the episode fades to black. But there's solid implications given a certain reveal that something sinister might be awaiting them in their fate, sadly. But that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of Pumpkinhead. So I'm going to say this up front about Pumpkinhead. I think that the directing of this episode is fairly competent. It has the same budget as your average Haunting Hour episode, but what Neil Fernley really does well in this episode is he makes it feel like a slasher almost, where the killer is kind of stalking their victims. And he pulled it off really well here for kids. And this coincides with the changes from the source material to the episode here. I don't know if this was Eric Patterson and Jessica Scott's doing, or maybe the director's doing, but there's certain scenes in this episode that were not in the short story that are absolutely frightening. And what I'm getting at is the Pumpkinhead scarecrow lair thing in that room. This stuff looks like a mid-2000s horror film. Straight up. I mean, they really pull out no stops with trying to actually frighten a younger audience here. And I can totally see why that this was one of the handful of episodes. I actually do remember something about this. Because when this show was coming out, everybody was using the internet. And I remember I was on like Google or something looking up the show and see what people thought. Apparently this episode, going off my memory, parents freaked out that their kids were watching something like this because they actually thought it was a real horror movie. And there's some effects in this episode that aren't as shocking as the short story counterpart here, which is, I can totally see why they didn't do the exact angle they did here. But holy crap, some of this stuff is nightmare fuel for a kid, I feel. Even though, to me as an adult with adult eyes, the effects kind of look like something straight out of a Charles Band movie at times. But holy crap, this stuff really does hold up. Give or take some weird 2011 humor. I kind of skimmed over the surface about this. Frankie Jonas's character, Dave, dresses up like a zombie Justin Bieber. Yeah, I mean, say what you will. I mean, this was 2011, but yeah, there could be some mild dated things about it. But yeah, I mean, there's something about this episode that just really does hold up well, despite some, like I said, the dated Justin Bieber reference and all that. Maybe it still could be relevant to you out there. I don't know. But that really is important to this show, I guess, because it's like the newest of the R.L. Stine anthology shows. Even though it went off the air, I think, 10 years ago at this point. It's still the most fresh, so it's kind of easier to scrutinize. But yeah, really solid production behind this episode. One thing I think that does excel well here, even though this episode is set on Halloween, you don't really feel the Halloween atmosphere. I mean, you get kids in costumes and you get candy and all that, but you really get like a fall harvest atmosphere because it's set in a pumpkin patch. And R.L. Stine pumpkin patch stories, normally for me, the ones that I have read outside of Pumpkinhead, are not that good. Or they kind of feel like the same story. I kind of feel like Devin's story from One of the Haunted Masks is kind of like a reimagined version of Pumpkinhead in some ways, when you think about it. But nonetheless, I do think that this story here did something kind of cool with the idea. And I don't know, it still feels kind of fresh, even though I've seen plenty of scarecrow horror movies. I've seen Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns, read Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns from Goosebumps. I just watched Carved from Hulu this year, another pumpkin horror story. They all kind of run a similar wavelength of idea and what they're able to do with the pumpkins and stuff. But this one did something really cool. And I think that goes back to the slasher element. It still feels kind of fresh here. The acting also, I feel, really does help save this episode. Whether we're talking about the farmer guy, Mr. Palmer, I think his actor was really creepy. Casey Rawls did a fantastic job as Allie. I think Frankie Jonas did a good job as Dave. And even the kid, I don't know his name, whoever played Scott, he was pretty good. And I think because of the performances being charming and all that, that did help some of the slower moments of the episode. And honestly, in terms of like tone and maintaining tone, this is one of those stories that is played up straight, but has its smart moments of humor in it, and I genuinely laugh with this episode more than laugh at it, because it's very common with these kids horror shows that you can just laugh at how badly executed some of this stuff is at times, and some people can find charm in that. Normally I really can't if I'm laughing at it like that, if I'm cringing simultaneously. But even when this episode got a bit cringy, it still was charming, and it did help that it was well made, and executed the creepiness probably better than 98% of this show did, which I think this is ultimately even the creepiest kids horror show still to this day ever made. But this one just really stuck in that lane and maintained that momentum. And the pace on this episode is incredible, I would say. One of the better paced kids horror episodes I've ever seen. So yeah, I have a lot of positives with it. But I do have some drawbacks. This isn't a perfect episode in my opinion. And I'm just going to explain my thoughts and just leave it there. So one thing I think about this episode that irritates me is the first 10 seconds. When you see the flyer of the missing children, you already know the direction where the story's going. You already know that these characters either are going to do one of two things. They're going to find the missing kids and learn a revelation, or they themselves are going to become missing. So you already know that. You already know that if the story is lending them to go to a location early on, this location is probably going to be relevant in the story. And the pumpkin patch, you can put 2 and 2 together. You see the flyer missing kids, you go to the pumpkin patch. Obviously, the missing kids went to the pumpkin patch, and that's how they went missing. So when you see the pumpkin scarecrows in the shed thing, your mind already knows that this is somehow going to play a role. And because you know all that information, you're kind of just waiting around for when are we going to get to the abduction stuff, right? Are these kids going to get abducted by whatever's going on here at this farm? And over the time, you kind of learn that if they do get abducted, it's because of their own dumb decisions. As in the case of the main character, Scott. Everything that happens to him in this episode is kind of his fault. So it's kind of hard to really empathize with the character, because the characters do, in my opinion, make some pretty poor decisions in that slasher trope type of way. Now, I said that I think the slasher vibe really does bring out the creepiness in the story, which I think immediately does, but because we know pretty much where the story is going, there's no real intrigue of where the story is going. It's just how it's going to be there. And when you see characters make dumb decisions, it makes the how stick out harsher to me. And yeah, I can't really forgive some really dumb character decisions in this. I can kind of get maybe some loose reasons why, but like I said in the plot overview, Scott legitimately believed that these pumpkins were tampered with by Mr. Palmer to get back at them. Why would he tamper them to get back at you when he kicked you out and never touch the pumpkins to begin with? Like, how does that register in your mind, bro? I don't get that. It's just really dumb. And sadly, there's just odd choices in this episode that if you really think about it, you might be irritated by it. That is probably the biggest one. But the second thing that I think in that same realm really gets to me is Mr. Palmer and the entire reveal of the climax. In the short story, I think it works a bit better than the episode because of the angle, right? And what he's exactly doing makes a bit more sense than what he's actually doing here. In the episode, there's an added element. If you've read the short story, you know exactly what I'm talking about heads, let's just say. And the episode takes a weird blend of what I guess they're going for with the things revealed to be in the private garden. And I'm flabbergasted how that's a thing. Like, when you really think about that, you're like, okay. And then you look at who's revealed to be the main villain behind all this, and you look at them, and you look at some parts of their anatomy and you're like, okay, how did this happen? What is this essentially? When did this begin? I mean, I guess a few years ago, as the episode alluded to, but why? And what's exactly the motivations? I mean, this is the same problem I have with the short story inherently too, is that the motivations just seem mean-spirited for the sake of it and evil for the sake of it. But it lacks an emphasis on that for the sake of it. You know what I mean? Like, oh, he's just super evil, right? It to me, it just feels like it's hollow and missing something there to stand out as something great. Because in my opinion, all of the great stories that I've seen in kids' horror, the villains, if they're just going to be evil for the sake of it, there has to be some underlying theme in dealing with them and what that's going to entail, right? If this episode is saying anything, which I don't think every kids' horror episode needs to say something significant or have much impact, but I was kind of hoping that, the cautionary tale of, I guess, don't bite the hand that feeds you, or don't bite off more than you can chew, or be safe on Halloween. I guess this is like a weird inflection on that, because parents have this weird fascination about hovering over their kids on Halloween around this time of year nowadays, where they don't want to let their kids out of their sight because psychos can poison them, put glass in their candy, abduct them because they're out by themselves. This might be a play and an inflection on that fear, but it does nothing with it, really. And if this story actually wove together some more themes into it, I think this would have hit harder and possibly would have scared me a bit more, because it would have made me think harder about it. And it's sad because I think on a technical basis, this was made very well, and it does execute some creepy scenes, and I can totally see how that might scare children. But at the end of the day, it feels a little too try-hard to try to overcompensate some issues they probably had in the adaptation process of adapting the short story to the episode. And they had to let a lot of things slide in loosely and mull over it just to make the shock value stick, which I get that approach. If you're trying just to scare, which if that's all this episode was trying to do, if the creators are watching, kudos to you. You succeeded at that. But to me, it didn't really sell me on the story aspect and make it feel all that, special. But at the end of the day, Pumpkinhead is a very entertaining episode. Don't take those negatives like I'm really bashing this episode over the head. Those are more smallish to mild medium-ish issues, but in my opinion, I think this episode is at least worthy of an A tier, because of how well it's made and how it's going to stick with you for better or for worse. Even though most people probably don't see the negatives like I do in it, I get that. I still think that it's a pretty great episode nonetheless. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, with those issues, I decided to be a bit more fairer on this one than I have been on others, because I think others just annoyed me a bit more with the issues they had. This one didn't annoy me as much as just made me slightly roll my eyes and kind of disappointed at times. But I'd probably give this like a 4.6 out of 5 stars. It's an A-, but it's still worthy of an A, and I think this is a fantastic episode and definitely a must-watch from the Haunting Hour TV show. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Pumpkinhead. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.